Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be doing the History Challenge tag. For those of you who don't know, the History Challenge is a readathon that's going on throughout the later half of August. I will put the hosts as well as the readathon Twitter down in the description. This tag was made by those hosts so that we can talk about the History Challenge and history books in general. So, the first question in the tag is, what first got you into history? This is definitely an interesting question. History has never been one of the subjects that was like in the forefront of my brain in elementary school or middle school or any of that. It wasn't my worst subject either, so it was sort of in the middle, but I don't remember having very many feelings about it until college. I was an English major, but of course you kind of have history tied in with literature. And you also have to take kind of the standard classes as well. And the more I learned in college, the more I realized I hadn't learned in like high school and middle school and all of that. So that kind of started to get me interested a little bit, but really my interest didn't pick up that much until the later half of my undergrad when I got more into the LGBT community and realized how little is talked about in regards to LGBT history. And I also took women's and gender studies, and so that was kind of a push in that direction as well. I also started to learn a little bit more about sociology. Instead of starting off in a regular program for graduate school, I actually started in my gender studies certificate program. So I took one women's and gender studies course before everything else, and being in that and the amount of history that we learned from there definitely influenced me a whole lot, and I ended up choosing sociology from there. And I definitely think that being a sociologist really impacted the way that I'm interested in history as well. I'm really interested in how the history and the events that were going on impacted the population, and really how it still has an impact now. So that's kind of where I'm situated in terms of why I'm interested in history, and it definitely had an impact on the areas of history that I'm interested in too, which I'll get into through the course of this tag. The second question is, what is your favorite history book or author? And for this, I have two answers. This first book, well, actually both of these books I've talked about a few different times on my channel, but the first one that I'm going to mention is Making History by Eric Marcus. This is the first edition. The second edition is called Making Gay History. There's also a podcast where you can listen to pretty much everything that's in here and more. This is an oral history book. So Eric Marcus went and interviewed a number of different people who were around in the LGBT movement from 1945 to 1990. This really impacted me in a lot of different ways. I was already engaged with the LGBT community before, but this really gave me more insight into history. I learned a lot from this, and it made me a lot more passionate about learning about LGBT history and I guess being a part of the community in general, because it also gave me a different perspective on how people were treated historically. In general, I think that oral history and hearing history from the source, but also hearing about marginalized histories from marginalized people is very important. Which kind of leads us fairly nicely into Black Feminist Thought by Patricia Hill Collins. This, I don't think is necessarily called like a history book. I'm looking on the back. It's housed in women's studies, African American studies, and sociology. But this book is about history. Basically, in the beginning of this book, she talks about how Black women historically have been ignored and not listened to, so we need to question where a lot of our ideas are coming from and look into what sort of ideas happen when we actually do center Black women's voices. And this looks historically at different Black female thinkers, and you get a good glimpse into their history and how their history impacts how they're treated now. So I think this is a really important book about history and about how we can use history. And personally, I think that everyone should read it who's interested in social justice in any capacity. The next question in this tag is your most anticipated history book that you have not read yet. And for this, I'm going to give you two different answers. One is going to be my most anticipated that's on my TBR for the history challenge, and then the other one is going to be something that's not on that TBR. The one that I'm most anticipating on my TBR is Tinderbox, The Untold Story of the Upstairs Lounge Fire and the Rise of Gay Liberation by Robert Fieldszer. So like the title says, this is about the Upstairs Lounge Fire. The Upstairs Lounge was a LGBT hangout spot, and somebody committed arson in 1973. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but over 20 people died in this arson. I'm really anticipating to get to this for a number of reasons. For one thing, learning about LGBT history in the mid to late 1900s is really interesting to me. But with this event in particular, I also have a little bit of emotion tied to it. I wrote an Instagram post about it, or I will be writing an Instagram post and it will be up before this video. But basically in the summer of 2016, I did a lot of research in regards to hate crimes. I was specifically collecting a list for Transgender Day of Remembrance, but I ended up looking at other hate crimes as well because I had this asinine, to be honest, idea that maybe I could just write a list for everyone and then we could use the name somewhere else. But really it wasn't a project that I should have taken on by myself anyways. Adding on to all of this, the Pulse shooting happened in Orlando, Florida that same summer. So I had a lot of like existential feelings. And one of the big events that I remember really well and tried really hard to look into to get as many details as possible was the New Orleans Upstairs Lounge Fire. And I remember only finding a few articles, and some of the information was a little bit different. And there were 3 people who were never identified, and that just really impacted me. So when I found this book about a year ago, but it was published in 2018. Yeah, it was like weirdly healing in a way to see that somebody did take the time to research it. And I mean, it's not the longest book, but it's pretty hefty, especially for like a one-day event. So I've got a lot of feelings about this outside of it just being an event that I haven't heard much about that's vaguely interesting. And the next book that I have a lot shorter of an explanation for, and that is Transgender History by Susan Stryker. I've read pieces of this, but I really want to get to reading the whole thing. This is like the book on transgender history. Like if you're interested in it in any capacity, Susan Stryker is the person to go to. Question number 4 for this tag is, what is your favorite time period and why? And then what book do you want to read about it, or have you already read? I feel like this question might be different if you asked me at a different time, but really for the past while, I've been really interested in looking basically between the 1960s and early 1990s. Specifically, I've been more interested in looking at kind of Black history and LGBT history. In general, I'm interested in kind of minority histories. Like I said, my background's kind of in women's and gender studies, so that kind of seems natural to look into minority histories. So like, even though like that time period is what I'm focused on, I don't think that I would be as interested in looking at stuff about like the Cold War or things that are like about politics but disconnected from minority histories. I really don't think that I would be that interested. But I'm interested in the civil rights movement and the LGBT movement throughout this time, and I'm also interested to learn more about other minority histories during the time as well. So far as what books I have about that, I have a fair amount of books about this era. Honestly, most of the books that are on my History Challenge TBR at least touch on that to some degree. One of them I am a chapter and a half away from finishing, and that is Moving Politics by Deborah Gould. This specifically looks at the role of emotion in ACT UP. So throughout this whole book, it looks kind of starting in the early 80s and through like the mid 1990s, and at the condition of AIDS activism. So this doesn't just talk about ACT UP or necessarily just talk about AIDS activism, because it hits on a lot of things with the LGBT community in general, and also at a lot of things that were going on policy-wise. And I really like the perspective that this book takes, because you get to learn about all of these different elements. You get to learn about the policy, you get to learn about what people were agreeing about and what people were disagreeing about. she pulls up different newspaper articles and literature that ACT UP was putting out. But she also really focuses in on emotions and the way that people express their emotions or were allowed to express their emotions really colored how this movement went. This is kind of a little bit more of an academic book, so if you're not super familiar with dealing with academic texts, I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend this, but if you are interested and familiar with sociology and political science texts, I would definitely recommend this if you're interested in that time period. Then number 5 is a time period that you want to learn more about, and then a book that you have read or want to read on that time period. And this is a little bit difficult to say just because there are a lot of things that I'm interested in, but I have a hard time focusing on things that aren't like immediately what I'm interested in. So even if there are like parts of history that I'm like, oh, like what happened then? I can't sit and read a whole book about it unless I am totally invested. I don't know what my problem is. But a couple of things that I do know that I am really interested in and would want to read fairly soon. First we have macro histories. Like I mentioned before, I'm interested in how history, like a long time ago, still impacts things now. A book that I have read on that is American Apartheid by Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton. I actually read this for a class, and this looks at basically how segregation was created and maintained and why it was so different for Black people than it was for other people of color who technically were told to live in certain places, but there was a really large difference in how intensely they were segregated. Because even though they were kind of segregated, they still had more of a variety of people around them. And there are also like a variety of different reasons why some of those groups were able to assimilate into whiteness. So this really talks about the issue of segregation really intensely and looks at it over time and why segregation would still be impacting us now. A book that I would like to read that also deals with like macro history is Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity. This is on my TBR for the History Challenge. I do not anticipate reading all of it because while it's a reasonable size, it's pretty dense. I actually have started on it. I've read through the first chapter and it's really interesting. This is basically looking at the history of race and gender and how those histories are tied, and it specifically situates that within kind of the legacy of Black trans people. And another area of history that I really want to learn more about would be in regards to like linguistics and etymology of certain things, mostly surrounding the LGBT community. And this again fits in with what I studied. My thesis focused on identity language in the LGBT community. So I actually have a few different books that I know I for sure want to read that kind of relate to that. Speaking in Queer Tongues, Globalization and Gay Language. And from my understanding, this looks at how people are impacted globally by language around the LGBT community. I'm not 100% sure since I haven't read it, but I've really wanted to get to this one. There's also What's Your Pronoun by Dennis Barron, which is the history of pronouns and pronoun usage. Of course, this is not specifically about the LGBT community. The question of a gender-neutral pronoun spans way before recent discussion of non-binary people. So I'm really interested in that. And then this one, I guess, spoiler alert if you pay attention to my videos, this one is actually going to be on my TBR for next month. And that is Word Slut, A Feminist Guide to Taking Back the English Language. And this looks at where a lot of sexist language actually originates from and how it's kind of changed and why it is how it is now. Other than that, in general, I am interested in other minority histories in the context of the United States. I'd like to know about more Indigenous, Native American history. And I'd like to be able to branch some out of American history as well. One of the big reasons that I'm looking a lot at American history is because that's where I live and that's the context that I do a lot of my sociology stuff in. But I would like to be able to branch more outside of that. I'm not exactly sure where I would start. I think that a kind of natural place to look is probably going to be LGBT history, looking across other countries, but I don't have necessarily like immediate plans in the work or books kind of off the top of my head that I know that I want to be reading on that, but it is kind of in my periphery. And once I get some of my other topical TBRs kind of under control a little bit, I might start looking more into that. Question number 5 is, who is your favorite person in history, and what is a book that you have read or would like to read about them? This question is a little bit difficult because I don't really have like one figure that I'm super interested in. Like, I know some people have like their pet historical figure that they really want to learn everything about, but I don't really have that so much. I have specific topics, like you've probably figured out at this point. But I am interested in learning more about radical Black thinkers from like the 60s and 70s. So a few different books that I'm interested in reading include Revolutionary Suicide by Huey Newton. This is actually on my list to read this month. Asada Shakur is another person who I'm interested in learning about. I actually started her autobiography a while back, and I really need to pick it back up. There is no real reason that I put it down. I kind of got in a reading slump. And then also I am very interested in reading about Angela Davis. And I think this doesn't just go for Angela Davis, this goes for all of them. I'm interested in learning about them and their lives, but I'm really interested in their political philosophy and how their life and environment shaped that political philosophy. Question number 7 is, what history topic do you want to see more fiction or nonfiction books on? Honestly, there are a lot of things that we should probably have more books on. One of the first things that comes to mind is more comprehensive and inclusive history of the LGBT community. One of the problems that I faced when I was originally researching some stuff for my thesis, and this was a few years ago, so there are probably more books that have come out since then, but a lot of the books that I had to choose from to write up my section on gay history were very white and very male-centered, so it would really be nice to see more of a diverse history. Within that, I would also like to see more about other cultures and what we would consider LGBT people from those cultures. However, I honestly haven't done my fair research into that, so I'm not sure that it would be fair for me to say there needs to be more about this, because it might just be out there and I don't know about it. A specific thing that's related to that I found that I really, really want is histories and memoirs from people of color who were HIV positive during the AIDS epidemic. One of the things that Moving Politics talks about is how some of the divisiveness around race and gender was, because a lot of the people who were actually HIV positive in the group were white gay men. So a lot of the people who were talking about women's issues and issues for people of color were HIV negative, which definitely makes me want to know what was happening with people of color who were HIV positive. I know that as somebody who kind of knows what was going on a little bit, I would imagine that they just had a lot more barriers to being involved in that sort of activism. But even when I was originally putting together my HIV and AIDS TBR, I could not find that many books about people of color during the AIDS epidemic, even though a large majority of the people who were at risk for HIV and AIDS were people of color. I did find 2 books that kind of sort of hit on that. The Secret Epidemic by Jacob Levinson and Breaking the Walls of Silence by the members of the ACE program. But the thing with both of these is that neither of them are memoirs, for one thing. And I'd really like to have a memoir, especially to go alongside the Secret Epidemic. And then Breaking the Walls of Silence is not necessarily just about women of color. It's specifically about women who were in a specific prison, and one of the main leaders of this was a Black woman. And she's actually the reason why I ended up getting this. Katrina Haslip was a big activist in the early 90s that advocated for women with AIDS and people in prison who are HIV positive. But even though I have these 2 books, I still don't have any memoirs. I still don't have very much from Women of Color. Really what I wanted was a memoir or biography about Katrina Haslip, and that didn't happen. The next question is asking what non-book resources do you use to learn about history? I really like documentaries. I'm a huge fan of documentaries. Oftentimes I'll watch that instead of a movie when I'm just like sitting around. Sometimes it's about the areas that I'm interested in, but honestly, non-book resources are really good for areas that I have an interest in, but can't really take the time or use the brain power to actually read about it. So watching documentaries about different parts of history, and really PBS Eons is one of the things that I've absolutely loved watching recently. PBS Eons is a YouTube channel, and it looks at prehistory. There are a lot of dinosaurs and other creatures like that, and that's really fascinating to me. I don't think I've ever read a dinosaur book, but I really like learning about it. I, as a kid, was obsessed with animals and different things like that, so it seems natural that that would be preserved some way, and I just really like learning about old animals. Question number 9 is a fun history fact or history quote. And this one I was honestly blanking on a little bit. I know that there are probably lots of interesting facts and quotes from things that I've read before, but right now the main thing that's going on in my brain is my current read. So I'm going to share a fact that it talks about in moving politics. I'm not sure I would call it fun, but it is interesting and something that I did not know before reading this. And that is that there was a Supreme Court case in 1986. So, I mean, it's not super recent, but it's surprisingly recent to me. Bowers versus Hardwick, that ruled that states that have policies that are specifically against gay sex, that specifically target homosexuals, were constitutional. So this 1986 ruling upheld homophobia in policy, which just blew my mind when I read it, first of all, because I was kind of under the impression that those laws were super old, and I knew that they didn't get ruled as unconstitutional until 2003, but I didn't know that there was a Supreme Court case as recently as the 80s that said that they were constitutional. So I'll be honest, I was really pissed that I didn't know that, just because that seems really important. And then finally, number 10 is to shout out a booktuber you enjoy who also reads history. The first person that comes to mind really focuses in on political science, but to me, there's an essential piece of political science as well as sociology and other kind of social science related stuff that necessitates history, so I end up lumping them together. But that's going to be Brianna's Library. I've seen them read a lot of stuff that looks more historically, even though it's political science and political science oriented, I would still call it history. Another person is the Francophile reader, who reads things that are very different from me, but I think that it's really interesting to listen to people talk about stuff that I'm not necessarily interested in the same way. I guess similar in how I watch a bunch of PBS Eons, like I don't really know about that stuff, but it's cool to learn about. That's kind of the same relationship that I have with some other channels that are interested in topics that I don't really know much about. So I think that's all that I have for this tag. I feel like I was really long-winded, so I don't know how long this is going to end up being. But hopefully you enjoyed it. If you've read any of these books, let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in reading history books or learning about history, definitely let me know what areas you are interested in. I am really bad at tagging people in general. And these sorts of things. My anxiety kind of gets to me. But if you're watching this and are at all interested in history, or if you're doing the history challenge, consider yourself tagged. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.